Okay, this week we're going to be looking at a period in art history known as the Baroque. But before we get to the Baroque, we're going to look at a very short period between the Renaissance and the Baroque known as Mannerism. We saw in the end of the last audio lecture the work by Michelangelo, The Last Judgment. And we noticed how it veered away from the classical ideals of poise and balance and harmony and created a very colorful, very energetic, very chaotic by classical Renaissance standards type of work. Everything was in turbulence. We see Christ in the top, in the middle. Kind of difficult to see. He doesn't have his usual beard or glowing halo. We see all the figures on the right side of the image descending into hell or being pulled down by demons at the bottom. And on the left side of the image we see people coming from their graves and being raised into heaven. And this painting marked a transition, a major transition in the art of the Renaissance. It exists in the Sistine Chapel. It's the back wall of the chapel behind the altar. And it foreshadowed a more turbulent, emotional, and erratic period of art that represented a concise break with the Renaissance. The movement that came out of it was known as Mannerism, but before we get to that, this is a detail of the Last Judgment, and you'll see that there's a flayed human being with hanging skin in the middle of the picture, and that's said to be a self-portrait of Michelangelo. So why he put himself into the picture as a flayed human being, nobody's quite sure, but obviously has a lot to do with his sense of torment and emotional expression. So the movement that came out of came right after the Renaissance, was a short movement known as Mannerism. It existed largely in Italy, and it was defined by rather odd positions, odd anatomies, unusual colors. And so here we have Pantormo's deposition from the cross. And probably what is striking about this picture is the pinks and the sky blues and the greens, and then the bodies of the figures, the guy crouching in the middle, the distorted body of Christ. And so Mannerism has this association with it of being unusual forms and distortions, moving very, very far away from the classical ideas of correct proportion and coloring, and then sort of the realism attached to that. This is another Mannerist picture, this time by Bronzino. Again, we see the same sort of physical distortions. There's Cupid in the middle and his mother, Venus, whom he's caressing. And we notice that the body is twisted in various ways. One element of Mannerist art was that it was created essentially for an elite group of scholars and people that were what we would say are in the know. So they're very, very educated in the classics. And this painting is a very good example of that. Most people looking at the painting would have no idea what it's about. People who were steeped in reading the classics, the Greek and Roman classics, would be able to decipher it based on various books from the Greek and Roman era. So what it is, it's a meditation on love. And so what we have in the middle is Venus, the god of love, and Cupid, her son, Cupid's arrow, making people fall in love. And they're in a very erotic embrace with each other. And on the right side is a little, what we call a putti, kind of angel, coming in, about to throw flowers and roses on the couple. And so this represents, in terms of Bronzino and the scholars he was painting for, the first stage of love, very physical, very lustful, very erotic, and very sensual. And right behind the little putti that's coming in, ready to throw the flowers, we see another figure. And if you look very, very closely, although it's very hard to see from this slide, she's got a snake's tail at the bottom, sort of a serpent. So she's half human on the top and half serpent in the bottom. And in the middle of the picture she's holding a honeycomb, and just to the right of the picture we see her hand, and it's actually holding the serpent's tail. And her name is Deception, and what she is the deceptive side of love. So we look at her, she's presenting the honeycomb, the sweetness, but in the other hand, behind her, she's got the stinger, the poison. And if you look really closely, you'll notice that the hands are on backwards. So on her right arm, she has a left hand, and on her, and vice versa the other way. So she's not what she seems. All is wrong. All is misplaced. And so she's that aspect of love where people begin to deceive each other and lie and cheat. And that's carried on over to the left side of the picture where we see between Cupid's back and Venus's arm another figure tearing her hair out, and her name is Jealousy. And so she's in a rage, she's gone mad, and jealousy is not possible if you haven't been really that in love or that attached to something. So here we have another stage in the process of love. After deception comes the madness and the torture of jealousy. And at the top, we see Father Time pulling back the cape on the whole scene. And so he's meant to represent that over time we begin to see all of these elements. And the rest of the painting is littered with various masks and half of a head at the top. And these are meant to portray illusion and deception and wearing a mask and pretending to be something you're not and all of that. So it's a rather cynical view of love, but one that was found in a lot of the Greek classics. And so these sorts of paintings were meant to be private paintings for the elite, for the educated, to sort of revel in their own self-knowledge of the classics, not really meant for popular view. This period is rather short. What we move into next is a really big piece of Western art history known as the Baroque. And the Baroque period begins roughly around the Reformation. And there's two key elements that are involved in the Baroque. One is the Reformation, which occurred in 1517, and then the Counter-Reformation. So what happens with the Reformation is that we have someone by the name of Martin Luther up north in Germany beginning to challenge the church and beginning to look at the church and see a lot of corruption. The preachers and priests would travel the countryside in Germany offering what they called indulgences. Indulgences were a way to forgive sins by paying money. So there were certain prices attached to certain sins, and if you were able to pay the priest for your own sins or for a member of your family who sinned, the priest would be able to say a prayer and do a mass and get the person out of hell or stop them from going to hell. And Martin Luther and many, many people up north were very suspicious of this. They saw these priests as very wealthy, living high on the hog, taking people's money, and at the same time corrupt. They weren't celibate, they were fostering children, and so they seemed very ungodly. And so this is where the Catholic Church, up until now the only Christian church that dominated Europe was the Catholic Church. With the Reformation we get that split. Martin Luther challenges the church, and as a result of that challenge the church splits. And we get a group of people almost entirely in the northern part of Europe breaking away from the Catholic Church and going their own way, whether it's Calvinism, Lutheranism, etc. You think of the Pilgrims, they were a breakaway church that came to the United States from Holland and England and various countries in the north of Europe. This break was also occasioned by the development of the printing press in the mid-15th century. Johannes Gutenberg's development of what's called movable type, where he could put in separate individual letters and then print it on a press. And what this enabled was the printing of books. And probably the most important book that they printed was the Gutenberg Bible. What this did was it allowed people to have copies of the Bible for the first time in history. Prior to that, copies of the Bible were handwritten. As a result, they were very rare, very expensive, and they belonged largely to the church. And so anybody's access to the Bible was through the priest. You would go to Mass on Sunday, the priest would tell you about the Bible, read a few passages, and give you the interpretation, and that was all people knew. With the development of the Gutenberg Bible and various other books and texts regarding religion or mythology, people began to look at the Bible themselves and read passages and sort of derive their own interpretations and their own meaning. And what this did, it enhanced that split where people began to break away. Now that they had access to the Bible, they felt that they also could create access to God without the church. And so for the Protestants living up north in Europe, the Reformation was a break from the church that it said that people do not need everything that the Catholic Church was offering. All that they needed was a personal relationship to God. And so the idea was that God was something that could relate to you directly. God did not have to go through the church, the Catholic Church, which was one of the teachings of the Catholic Church, that they were God's messengers on earth. But with the Protestants, they felt they didn't need that middleman, that intermediary, that they could have a direct spiritual relationship to the church. And so what happened visually, in terms of the visual arts, was that they felt that everything the church represented at the time was seen as a distraction. And so art, music, song, all of these things were seen as distractions. And this sort of accounts for why the Protestants, the Lutherans, the Calvinists, the Puritans, they wore black all the time in their buildings. Their churches were white. They didn't drink alcohol. They didn't have songs. They didn't have choral. Their masses weren't very ritualistic. So everything was about stripping things down to the bare basics and the bare necessities of one's relationship to God. And anything of color or music or smell or taste or sound, the senses were seen as traps, distractions, ways of taking you away from your direct relationship to God. So from a visual point of view, the Reformation was a very austere, minimalist, puritanical kind of world. Now the Catholic Church, knowing that this was happening and seeing it happen, decided to counter it. And this was what's known as the Counter-Reformation. And the Counter-Reformation was about going the opposite direction. So what the Catholic Church did was they turned up the volume on the theatrical aspect of the Mass. And so we have, for instance, the Sistine Chapel, which obviously came before the Reformation, but the people down south had intimations that it was coming. It didn't just appear in 1517. And on the right, we see Bernini, a very famous sculptor of the Reformation, his canopy, baldacchino, over the grave of St. Peter in St. Peter's in the Vatican in Rome. And what you see here is a push to create a very emotional, powerful, and dramatic atmosphere. So paintings, choral songs, incense, gold-encrusted robes, jewels, chalices. The whole idea of the Counter-Reformation was to pull in the opposite direction, and the idea being that people would be drawn to that the austerity of the Northern Protestant Reformation was, it lacked something, it was missing something, it was too pared down, and the church felt they could pull people back to the church by turning up basically the theatrical aspect of the Mass. And so that whole idea, that whole theatrical, dramatic, emotional aspect of the Counter-Reformation became very much a description of the art of the Baroque. In fact, in Italy at least, the church prescribed artists to sculpt and paint in a very particular way. And that particularity involved drama, action, emotion, miracles, not a very sort of rational, cool approach, but a very kind of visionary and emotional and impactful way of producing art. And so we have here Bernini, his version of David. Okay, so this is still the subject of David, which is very, very big throughout the Renaissance. But we see in Bernini's statue, he is about to throw the stone at Goliath. We see him twisting and contorting, loading the stone in his sling, contorting his face, just about to turn and throw the stone that kills Goliath. And so what we have in the Baroque is this dynamic movement and motion and highlighting the high point of the story. So this is just before he throws his stone. If we compare it to Michelangelo's David, we see a dramatic difference. Michelangelo's David is very classical. He's got the contrapposto stance, he's self-contained, he's pensive, he's thoughtful, he's sizing up the situation. He's very, very classical. The opposite of what Bernini's kind of emotional, dramatic approach is. We can also look at this in terms of the Greek world, in terms of classical art, the classical phase and the Hellenistic phase, which we saw was much more dramatic and emotional and intense. And so these two statues give us a very, very good comparison between the Renaissance and the Baroque. This is another statue by Bernini called the Ecstasy of St. Teresa, and we see her lying down, about to be stabbed in the heart by an angel and die. Saint Teresa wrote lots of books recording her visions. She would have hallucinations and visions of Christ and of sexual encounters with Christ. And so what we have here is Bernini sort of portraying one of those encounters, and so we have her parting her lips and closing her eyes, dying, but also dying in something we would probably describe more accurately as a sort of orgasmic death. And so the arrow that's about to pierce her heart would be this consummate union between her and her spirituality and her mysticism in relation to Christ. And if so, we look at it, again, we get all those dramatic ideas. We get the diagonals, we get the facial expression, and then more importantly, we look at her robe. Robes don't fall like that on the human body. This robe is all animated, it's all in motion. It's like it's got its own life and it's moving. No classical sculptor would have sculpted a robe like this. It's way too animated, way too dramatic to be realistic. But it's this dramatic, almost visionary aspect of the Counter-Reformation that came to define the sculpture and the art. We can see a similar comparison in paintings. Here we have Leonardo's The Last Supper, very composed, Christ is in the middle, easy to read. And if we compare it with Tintoretto's The Last Supper, we see it's very chaotic. There's lots more movement. We see Christ in the center, but we have this strong diagonal line drawing us back into the picture. Lots of people moving around, more than just the apostles. Various light sources. We have angels in this, up in the top of the painting swirling down. Light sources around the halos of the apostles. And so this also is a very typical painting in terms of the Baroque style. Very visionary, dealing with the supernatural. The diagonal line was very important. The diagonal was a way of pulling people into the picture, where we have this deep recession to the back that would come forward, and the idea being that it would move into our space. And so with the Counter-Reformation, your attachment and your involvement in the art was very much part of the Counter-Reformation's rules for artists and how to paint. Probably one of the most famous, if not the most famous, Italian Baroque painter is Caravaggio. And we can see in his paintings there's a realism, there's a strong realistic element. And so he doesn't have any halos, no angels, no supernatural elements. Christ is wearing a dirty white robe, and his apostles have old clothes with holes in them. But what we get from Caravaggio is this deep, deep realism that really makes the Renaissance almost look Byzantine. The Renaissance, by comparison, would be very sort of fake, the way people were arranged and laid out, and the lighting of Renaissance paintings was kind of evenly dispersed all over the picture. In Baroque paintings, we tend to get a spotlight sort of effect. So we get lots of blacks, deep darks in the back of the image, and then very bright, strong lights that the artist is using to control what it is we look at in the picture. And so the focus in this painting becomes that the apostles, the heads of the apostles, and most importantly, Thomas's finger going into Christ's wound. This is a scene in the Bible where Christ is resurrected after his death, and he meets his disciples, and many of them don't recognize him. They come to understand that that is Christ, but one person, one of the disciples, Thomas, was very, very doubtful, hence the term doubting Thomas, and he wanted to see the wound. And so when Christ showed him his wound, apparently he was still skeptical. Maybe he thought it was a makeup job or something. And so Christ takes his hand and pushes his finger into his wound to demonstrate to Thomas that this is actually a real wound. So we had the dramatic part of the story, the high point of the story, which is the finger going into Christ's side. We get this intense realism and a very dramatic, emotional kind of effect. Now, Caravaggio was in trouble. He was in trouble for a lot of things. He was wild. He drank a lot. He was constantly dueling with people, having sword fights. And in his paintings, he was constantly in trouble with the church. And the reason he was in trouble with this painting, for example, was that Christ was not portrayed in any idealistic way. He didn't have a halo, and his clothes weren't clean. And by portraying the apostles with dirty clothes with holes in them, this was considered a little bit too kind of realistic for the church. They wanted something slightly more idealized, especially for images of Christ. And then what really threw it over the top were the fingernails. Christ has dirty fingernails, and so does Thomas. And this was just, going a little too far. You do not paint Christ with dirt under his fingernails. But for Caravaggio, this was real. This was what Christ probably really looked like. And walking around the desert, not too many showers, not too many hot tubs, he probably was a pretty grungy guy, as well as his followers. So Caravaggio was all about trying to be very, very realistic and not supernatural and not fake, but still very dramatic and very powerful. He finally got into real trouble with this painting. The death of the Virgin was a very common subject. Many painters painted the death of the Virgin. They usually had her lying down, surrounded by weeping apostles and various people. Sometimes they have her being ascended into heaven. But for Caravaggio's version, keeping true to his realistic approach, he needed to have models, people model for him, and he would copy them. And so he had someone lie down and close her eyes, and he looked at her and figured, well, she doesn't look dead, she looks sleeping. And so he decided he needed a real dead body. And so he searched everywhere, and he found, finally, floating in the river in Rome, a dead prostitute. So he pulled her out of the water, he dried her off, he dressed her up, he laid her down, and he painted her. And she was all swollen and bloated from being in the river for that long. Well, when the church saw this painting and got wind that the Virgin Mary was actually a dead whore that he'd pulled out of the water, you can imagine why this guy was always in trouble with the church and why his paintings were rejected, but now they've come to be seen as some of the greatest masterpieces of Western art. Artemisia Gentileschi is one of the few women painters of this time that we have come to know only relatively recently as being a very popular and well-known painter at the time. Women had a very hard time being artists. It was considered not a suitable profession for women, expressing themselves in painting, and so they were often barred from access to being artists, which would have mostly been the art schools and the trainings or the ateliers and apprentice system. So the only time we had women who were painters at this time was if their father was a painter, and so they lived around the studio and they learned their craft from their father. And this is true of Artemisia. She was painting obviously in the Caravaggio style. You can see again the signature black background and strong dramatic lighting, as well as the strong element of the highlight of the story. And what this is the Judith cutting the head off Holofernes. Holofernes was a Persian general. He was about to invade a Hebrew army. Judith, before the battle, snuck over to the other side in the middle of the night, claimed that she did not want to die, and she renounced her Jewish religion and wanted to be, move over to the Persian side. And when she did, she met the general, Holofernes, and she seduced him and slept with him. And while he was sleeping, she pulled out his sword and cut his head off, and then snuck back in the middle of the night to the Hebrew camp with the general's head. And as a result of this, the story goes, the Hebrews were so emboldened, and the Persians had lost their king, or their generals, and eventually the Persians lost the battle, and the Hebrews won. So she's considered a Jewish heroine. And so Artemisia's painting, obviously highlighting the strong women in history, the women who have achieved things. And also this has been understood as a painting that's very anti-male, because Artemisia was raped by one of the students in her father's studio and took the unprecedented step of taking her rapist to court. This is something women had never really done, and in that court trial, Artemisia was tortured so that the judge could be certain that her testimony was true, whereas her rapist was just literally asked, did he do it or not? So again, a very bizarre understanding of women, and that a woman could not tell the truth unless she was tortured, whereas a man's word was always true. And so this is seen as a sort of pent-up emotion and violent feeling towards males and the lot of women. So a very interesting painter. One of the most famous painters of the Baroque period was Velázquez. Diego Velázquez, and here he is painting his most famous painting, Las Meninas, which means the maids. And what it is, it's a painting right in the middle of the Princess Margarita of the Spanish court, surrounded by her maids and the people who look after her. On the background on the left is a portrait of Velázquez himself painting a painting that we don't know what it is. And in the middle of the picture is a mirror, and in that mirror is the reflection of the king and queen of Spain. So it's a very interesting painting because we're wondering exactly what's going on. Is the Margarita being painted by Velázquez? If so, why is she standing on that side of the canvas? Is he painting a portrait of the king and queen, and we're the king and queen looking at him? Uh, if we are the king and queen and we are being painted, then the mirror doesn't make sense in terms of the direction and the reflection of the angles. One of the most interesting interpretations of this painting is that you see the canvas that he's working on is huge, and he doesn't have any paintings in his entire body of work that are that size, except this painting, which is 14 feet high. So what we have here is a picture of someone in the picture painting the picture that we're looking at. And so he's looking at us, he's painting us, and at the same time he's actually creating the painting that he's in. So it's kind of an interesting commentary and play on imagery and reproduction and reflection and who's looking at who. So a very fascinating painting. Also fascinating for its technique. It looks incredibly realistic, but sorry, I'm going to go back to that. But it's not. He's using paint in a way that had never been really used that much before, and that style is known as painterly. So there's lots of brush strokes and lots of marks. I'm going to come back to that in a second. This is another painting by Velázquez, the Rokeby Venus, and here he's taken the classical idea of the classical nude, usually attributed to Venus, lying down. But here again, he's using the device of a mirror. And so we have Venus looking in a mirror, looking at us. But at the same time, just like the last painting, if we actually were to look at all the angles, it would not have, this is not a realistic portrayal of how things could be. Like I said, the painting Velázquez was doing was very different than the paintings of the time. This is a typical painting of the 17th century, the Dutch Baroque. What we have is a highly, highly realistic style of painting, which you've seen starting back all the way with Van Eyck. And so we have a painting of some lobsters, of some drapery, of a lemon, of a horn, of pewter, of water. And these paintings were precisely executed and look almost entirely photographic. What happens with Velázquez is we get this really loose, kind of virtuosic use of the paint. And so if I zoom in here on the daughter, and you can see the king and queen in the background, we move closer, we begin to see that her clothing and what she's wearing is not painted photographically. In fact, it's painted very loose. We see the white highlights on her dress, which are just slashes of the brush, just very bold strokes. And this was very new for the time. People were not used to it. We move in close to the corsage she's wearing with flowers. All it is a bunch of squiggles and dabs and dots and brush strokes. Yet the whole thing put together, makes a very, very realistic image. The other artist, very famous for that approach, is this gentleman here. This is Rembrandt. This is a self-portrait of Rembrandt as an old man. And we can see all the oily, buttery kind of brush and paint that goes to make up his face, and even the curls in his hair on the upper right side of the painting. They're actually made by the back of the brush gouging into the paint. And so many Baroque painters were really exploring this use of paint. Where they weren't trying to hide it was paint and create an illusion. They were letting the thickness and the oiliness and the butteriness of the paint stand out. And so they had drips, they had brush strokes, and they had really, really thick areas of paint. For example, here's another painting by Rembrandt. Looks very realistic, very photographic, but if we zoom into her sleeve and the details on her sleeve, you see we get something like this, which almost looks like a pastry. Hard to really understand how he made it. But it does, when we go back, add up to this wonderfully embroidered sleeve. Similarly with this portrait, we look at his hands and his gloves and his cape. We move in close, we see the cape and the buttons are just dabs and slashes of paint. And then the gloves and the hands are rendered with a real economy of brushwork. So this was very, very hard to do, and anybody who's ever tried to paint will see that it looks easy, but it's incredibly difficult. The other thing Rembrandt did was paint portraits of himself throughout his entire career. And so we have early portraits of Rembrandt looking very confident, wearing armor, and looking very self-composed. We have portraits of Rembrandt embedded into particular scenes. There's Rembrandt in the middle, at the bottom, um, putting Christ up on the cross, and people might wonder, well, why has Rembrandt put himself in a painting where he's contributing to the death of Christ? And one of the interpretations that Rembrandt's work was very psychological, that by putting himself in the painting, he was making a statement that nobody is really free of sin or acting evil, that given the circumstances, almost any of us could be capable of doing something that we would normally not do. And so he's taken this very psychological approach to the human. And if I go back to his self-portrait, one of the key features of many of his works is the half dark and half light face. And so he often paints portraits with the faces in light on one side, shadow in the other. And this also is interpreted as meaning that there is a part of us that's hidden, part of us that's unseen, or we could say a part that's light and a part that's dark, the good and the evil. And so for Rembrandt, people embodied both of these qualities. There weren't good people and there weren't evil people, although obviously there were people who could go in those directions easily. But most of us had both aspects to us. The other thing that made Rembrandt famous was the way he did portraiture. Very many organizations in Holland, guilds, doctors, merchants, they would have these organizations. And so here is a group of doctors, and they requested that Rembrandt paint their portrait as was the custom back then. And what they would normally do is line up behind a table and their portrait would be painted one at a time, and you get this long painting with like 14 guys sitting looking at you. Rembrandt's great genius was to not do that, was to take the people and put them in a scene. And so here we have the doctors in an autopsy with a cadaver. And so we get the main doctor, Dr. Tulp, on the right with his black cape, and his more junior doctors leaning over, taking notes, observing. And so this was very, very new and very exciting at the time, and it made Rembrandt a very, very famous and popular painter by his ability to create these portraits into dramatic actions and dramatic scenes, again keeping in line with the Baroque idea of drama, black and white. This is his most famous dramatic painting, and also one of his, if not the most infamous painting. This was a painting of a militia. The captain is in the middle with the red sash, and the rest of the people in the painting were members of the militia. Now, these militias never really did fight. They were mostly men's clubs. They get together and they drink and they party and they clean guns and buy military outfits, but they never ever really experienced battle. They were, like I say, just glorified men's clubs. And this particular group commissioned Rembrandt for a portrait. So Rembrandt, got paid and painted everybody individually. But when they finally saw the final painting, not everybody was pleased. So if you look over to the right, you see a gentleman sticking his arm out, pointing towards the middle of the picture, and his arm is covering the face of somebody in the background. Likewise, if you look on the left, people's faces are hidden or buried, and all of these people paid the same amount of money, so you can understand a lot of them were really upset that they weren't given their due in the picture. Rembrandt's reply was, well, I'm the artist and I'm making a painting and I do it my way, which is the way that best describes the scene. So they weren't very happy with it. Of course the captain was, he's right there in the middle. But another thing which really pissed everybody off was the woman on the left side of the center. She's all lit up, she's very prominent. She's not part of the militia, so the militia were wondering, why is this woman in the painting? And there are various theories as to who she is and why she's there. One of the most prominent is that she looks strikingly a lot like Rembrandt's wife. So it might be the case that he was in trouble with the missus, and the one way to get out of that or to redeem himself was to put her in a very large action scene painting. As a result, the militia rejected the painting. They wouldn't accept it. They wanted their money back. Rembrandt was in court. Lots and lots of problems, and his career went downhill from then, which is very ironic because today this painting, now known as the Night Watch, is probably his most famous painting. And then finally, we look at the influence of architecture on the Baroque. One of the qualities of Baroque architecture was that it was a bit of a mishmash and a mix of many, many different styles. So we see in the front, at the bottom of this church, it's very classical, very Greek. At the same time, it's got the Roman arches and the Roman columns. And also, if you look at the windows in the upper right and the upper left, it has this kind of shell-like scalloped quality with lots of curves, lots of bends, lots of classical elements. And so Baroque churches were these sort of relatively frilly, over the top, everything that an architect knew was thrown in to the piece. Monticello, designed by Thomas Jefferson, is classical, but also combines various elements of the round windows of the dome and the half-circle window right there in the middle, the pointed arches. So kind of mixing together, but leaning more to the classical. And then finally we come to the late phase of the Baroque, which is often referred to as the Rococo phase. And this is where the churches are just sort of over the top, kind of wedding cakes, just white and gold and frilly bits and angels and scalloped bits. And this was the sort of the final phase of the Baroque before we come into the neoclassical and the Romantic era that defines the 19th century.